The night air in Auburn, Alabama, carried a warmth that felt almost ordinary. Crickets chirped lazily from the overgrown yards. Porch lights glowed softly, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. It was a summer night like any other. But for the Lawson family, it would be a night that would never feel ordinary again. Linda Lawson clutched a faded photograph as she walked along the cemetery path. The grass was damp under her shoes, the smell of freshly turned earth mixing with the faint scent of honeysuckle. She stopped in front of a small headstone, tracing the engraved letters with her fingers. Emily Lawson, 1968 to 1985. Emily was 17 the night she vanished, and 17 when her life was stolen. Her father, Roger, leaned against the iron fence, staring at the same stone. "How could this happen here?" he whispered. A question that had haunted the town for decades. How could a quiet Alabama community, where everyone knew their neighbors, be home to a crime so senseless, so cruel? The clock on the nearby church bell tower chimed 10 times, each toll a reminder of the years that had passed. But the memory of that night, the night Emily disappeared, was as vivid as the summer she was last seen riding her bike along Magnolia Street, the wind whipping through her hair, a smile that could light up any room. It was the last normal evening anyone would ever remember. On that night, Emily had said goodnight to her mother and gone outside for a final bike ride before dinner. She waved at Mrs. Hargrove, her elderly neighbor, who was tending her garden. She laughed at a joke a friend shouted from the sidewalk. But she never made it home. By midnight, the first whispers of panic began to ripple through the town. Flashlights swung through darkened streets. Dogs barked frantically. Calls to neighbors went unanswered. Every corner of Auburn seemed to hold a shadow, and every shadow whispered the same terrifying question: where was Emily Lawson? For decades, this question would remain unanswered. Generations of Auburn residents grew up hearing the story, each retelling adding layers of fear, speculation, and sorrow. Emily's disappearance became more than a crime, it became a wound in the town's heart, an unsolved mystery that refused to fade with time. And yet, on a quiet summer night, nearly 40 years later, a single phone call would shake Auburn to its core. A call that promised answers, that promised justice long delayed. The case that had haunted the community for decades was about to reopen, and no one would be prepared for what came next. This is the story of Emily Lawson, the night her life ended too soon, and the decades-long journey to uncover the truth. Emily Lawson wasn't just a teenager from Auburn, she was the heart of everyone who knew her. Friends called her Sunshine, a girl whose laughter could fill a room and whose curiosity was boundless. She spent hours at the library, devouring books about faraway places and the people who lived there, dreaming of one day becoming a journalist and telling stories that mattered. At school, she was known for her kindness. Teachers remembered her thoughtful questions in class, the way she stayed behind to help classmates struggling with homework. Coach Reynolds recalled how she volunteered for every school event, from the bake sale to the talent show, always with a smile and a willingness to do more than expected. To everyone, Emily was someone who carried hope wherever she went. She loved music, particularly the piano. On quiet afternoons, the sound of her fingers moving across the keys would drift down the hallway of the Lawson home. Neighbors said it had a way of softening even the hardest days. She also had a mischievous side, riding her bicycle with daring curves around the neighborhood, challenging friends to races that often ended in laughter and scraped knees. Her parents, Linda and Roger Lawson, described her as fiercely independent but deeply caring. She had this way of making you feel like the most important person in the world, Linda said in a 1985 local newspaper interview. Even when she was just 10, she would write little notes to people, telling them they mattered. That was Emily. But beneath her vibrant energy was a girl aware of the world around her. Emily was cautious, never trusting strangers easily, always checking in with her parents, always careful on the streets she rode her bike. And yet, even that caution couldn't shield her from the danger that would strike that summer night. Friends remembered the last summer she spent with them. Sleepovers in the backyard, late-night walks to the corner store, shared secrets and laughter under the stars. Each memory now carries a weight, a bittersweet reminder of the life that was abruptly taken. And then there were the small details that made Emily unforgettable. The freckles across her nose, the way she always twirled her hair when deep in thought, the way she hummed the same tune when she was happy or nervous. These little things grounded her as a real, human girl, not just a statistic in a crime report. For the Lawson family, her absence was unbearable. Roger Lawson often described evenings spent in the living room, staring at an empty chair where Emily used to sit. Holidays were quiet, birthdays were hollow, and every family photograph became a reminder of what had been lost. The town felt the void too. Teachers, neighbors, and friends mourned in their own ways, knowing that a bright, promising life had been cut short. Even the smallest details of her life hinted at what could have been. Emily had just begun saving money for college, applying for summer internships at local newspapers, and writing letters to pen pals in other states. She wanted to see the world beyond Auburn, to tell stories that mattered, to make a difference. All of that ended too soon. Yet, in the quietest corners of Auburn, some remembered her differently. The kids who played with her on the streets, the neighbors who heard her piano music drift through the evening air, the teachers who saw her potential, they all carried pieces of Emily with them. And for decades, those pieces became a silent plea for justice. Subtly, even at this early stage, there were hints of something deeper, a shadow in the neighborhood, a stranger's glance, a neighbor who always seemed to be watching. Small moments that, at the time, felt inconsequential. But as we would later learn, they were pieces of a puzzle that would take nearly 40 years to solve. Emily Lawson's life reminds us why cold cases matter. Not just for the thrill of solving a mystery, but for the human stories behind each tragedy, the dreams, the laughter, the love, and the unbearable absence that follows. This story isn't just about crime, it's about a girl who deserved a future she never got, and the community that refused to forget her. The last week of Emily Lawson's life was like any other summer week in Auburn, but with subtle hints that would later gain new meaning. Monday morning, she waved goodbye to her mother, backpack slung over one shoulder, her hair catching the sunlight as she walked down Magnolia Street. She stopped briefly to talk with her friend, Jessica Hart, who had been waiting at the corner. "Did you finish that story for the school paper?" Jessica asked. Emily laughed, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Almost. I'll have it done by Friday." Her excitement for writing was palpable, a small glimpse into her dreams of becoming a journalist. Tuesday, she spent the afternoon at the library, chatting quietly with Mr. Beckett, the librarian, about the historical archives she was researching for a school project. She borrowed books on journalism and American history, oblivious to the fact that the pages she carried home would never be fully read. On Wednesday, Emily and her younger brother, Michael, rode their bikes to the neighborhood store. They laughed as they competed to see who could reach the old oak tree first. Witnesses later recalled seeing her pause to help a stray dog tangled in a fence, a small act that showed her empathy, but also delayed her return home. Thursday evening brought something unusual. A neighbor, Mrs. Hargrove, remembered seeing a man standing near the corner of Magnolia Street, watching the children play. He wasn't familiar to the area, and his presence left her uneasy. At the time, she thought little of it, dismissing it as a passing stranger. But, as investigations would later reveal, that brief encounter was a critical piece of the timeline. Friday arrived, a hot summer day. Emily finished chores around the house and prepared for an evening ride. She called her friend Jessica to see if she wanted to meet at the park. Jessica couldn't join, so Emily decided to take a short solo ride before dinner, waving goodbye to her mother with a smile. That smile would be the last anyone saw that evening. She rode along familiar streets, the evening light casting long shadows across the sidewalks. Passers-by later recalled seeing her passing by, carefree, laughing at a small joke she shouted to herself. She stopped briefly at the corner store to buy a soda, chatting briefly with the cashier. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. By 8:30 p.m., Emily was nowhere in sight. Her parents, expecting her home for dinner, began to worry. Roger walked to the corner to see if she had returned from her ride. The streets were quiet. No sign of his daughter. A gnawing fear settled in, a feeling he couldn't shake. Neighbors noticed the absence too. Dogs barked at empty streets, porch lights flickered in the sudden quiet. One neighbor, Mr. Keaton, later recalled thinking, "I knew something wasn't right. It was too quiet. Too still." That night, the ordinary hum of summer turned into an unsettling silence. Early reports later revealed that Emily had been seen one last time around 9 p.m., walking past the old playground near the edge of town. Alone, carefree, and unaware that her path would intersect with a darkness that had been lurking nearby. That brief sighting became the final piece of her timeline, the last confirmed moment anyone saw her alive. Evenings like that, warm, calm, seemingly safe, had a cruel way of hiding danger. And in the shadows of Auburn, that danger waited, patient, unseen, until it struck. The clock ticked on, each second pushing Emily further from safety and closer to a fate that would haunt her family for decades. By the time the alarm was raised, by the time neighbors realized she hadn't returned, the ordinary streets of Auburn had transformed into a scene of fear, uncertainty, and growing panic. Every moment, every step she had taken that evening would later be scrutinized, each one a clue in a puzzle that seemed impossible to solve. This was the week that led to a tragedy no one in Auburn would ever forget. A week that ended in a crime that would remain unsolved for nearly 40 years, leaving a town desperate for answers and a family desperate for their daughter back. It was just past midnight when the first call came into Auburn Police Department. Mrs. Hargrove, the elderly neighbor who had seen the stranger earlier that week, had found something alarming. Her flashlight beam cut through the darkness, landing on an object partially hidden in the underbrush near the edge of the old playground. Officer Harold Jenkins was first on the scene. The air smelled faintly of wet grass and soil, but there was another, sharper odor, something metallic and unsettling. As he moved closer, he realized it was Emily Lawson. She lay on the ground, her body positioned strangely, as if frozen mid-motion, a detail that would haunt investigators for years to come. The scene was eerily quiet, broken only by the low murmur of concerned neighbors gathering at the edge of the clearing. Flashlights swung across the scene, illuminating the playground swings swaying gently in the wind. Nothing seemed out of place, except for the girl lying lifeless in the shadows. Detectives soon arrived, led by Sergeant Thomas Whitaker, a veteran officer with 2 decades of experience. He had seen crime scenes before, but something about this one felt different. The positioning of the body, the absence of obvious trauma in initial observation, and a few strange items nearby, all suggested this was no ordinary case. Among the details that baffled them, Emily's bicycle was missing, even though her shoes were still on the pavement. Her backpack lay open, its contents scattered, yet certain items, her journal, a notebook with story ideas, were untouched. A lone shoe, a crumpled note in the grass, and a small pendant she always wore were all that remained of her personal belongings. Neighbors were interviewed on the scene. Mrs. Hargrove, shaken, described the moment she saw Emily. "I thought she was sleeping, but then I realized she wasn't moving. I called out her name, and I just knew." Her voice trembled, and the sense of shock spread like wildfire through the small crowd. The initial investigation revealed contradictions almost immediately. One witness claimed to have seen a man in a dark jacket near the playground around the same time Emily disappeared. Another swore the area had been empty. These conflicting accounts would plague the investigation for years, muddying the truth and creating endless dead ends. Forensic teams combed the area meticulously. They noted tire tracks leading away from the scene, but the soil had been disturbed by recent rainfall, erasing many key impressions. Fingerprints were nearly non-existent, leaving investigators with little to no immediate evidence. And yet, something felt off. A tiny detail overlooked by almost everyone. The swing nearest to where Emily was found had faint, unusual scratches along the metal chain, scratches that didn't belong to ordinary use. By the early hours of the morning, Auburn was awake with news of the tragedy. Police tape cordoned off the area, and local reporters gathered, trying to capture the horror of a town suddenly stripped of innocence. Families peeked through windows, whispering questions no one had answers for. Who could do this? Why Emily? Could it happen to someone else? An autopsy was ordered immediately. Preliminary results would shock the investigators. While there were no signs of a violent struggle at first glance, there were subtle indicators, bruising, faint fibers, traces of an unknown substance, that suggested Emily had been attacked and restrained before her death. The coroner later described the findings as a meticulously orchestrated act of violence disguised in ordinary darkness. The night of the discovery left Auburn reeling. Parents whispered warnings to their children. Friends cried in disbelief. Even the most seasoned officers admitted that the shock of seeing a young girl taken in such a quiet town was almost unbearable. And yet, amid the grief and confusion, one thought lingered for everyone. There was someone responsible, and they were still out there. This discovery marked the beginning of a case that would haunt the town for decades. Every witness statement, every scuff mark, every overlooked clue from that night would become a piece of a puzzle investigators struggled to complete. But in the quiet moments, when the street lamps flickered over the playground, some wondered if the truth was already there, waiting to be found, hidden in plain sight. And so, Auburn's nightmare had begun. A town's sense of security shattered in a single night, leaving behind fear, grief, and questions that would take decades to answer. The clock was ticking, and Emily Lawson's story was only just beginning to unfold. The morning after Emily Lawson was found, Auburn Police Department was in full mobilization. Sergeant Thomas Whitaker, along with detectives Harold Jenkins and Cynthia Malone, began retracing every step Emily might have taken that fateful evening. The town, still reeling from shock, watched quietly, wondering if anyone could find the person responsible. Detective Malone, known for her methodical attention to detail, started with the neighbors. She knocked on doors, noting every tiny detail, the glances, the hesitations, the stories that didn't quite line up. Residents remembered seeing Emily that evening, but their accounts conflicted. One claimed she had been with a boy on a bike, another swore she was alone. Contradictions like these frustrated the investigators from the very start. Detective Jenkins focused on physical evidence, examining the playground, the surrounding streets, and any possible paths Emily might have taken. Tire tracks, faint footprints, and the swing scratches hinted at a struggle, but without clear connections, it was difficult to draw conclusions. The forensic tools of 1985 were limited. DNA testing was in its infancy, fingerprints were few, and trace fibers were almost impossible to analyze fully. Early interviews introduced the first wave of suspects, each more frustrating than the last. There was Robert Bobby Henderson, a 28-year-old handyman with a temper who lived 2 blocks from Emily. He was known to linger near the playground, but alibis and witness accounts eventually cleared him. Then there was Timothy Barnes, a local shop clerk who had argued with Emily's father over a minor debt days before her disappearance. Again, nothing concrete linked him to the crime. Every lead seemed promising at first but ended in disappointment. For weeks, detectives chased rumors and hunches. Each false trail added to the tension, the frustration, and the growing sense that Emily's disappearance was more calculated than anyone had imagined. Eyewitnesses offered fragments of the night. One neighbor claimed to have seen a dark car parked near the playground just before Emily vanished. Another insisted that a man in a light jacket had been following her from the corner store. These accounts conflicted, creating a confusing mosaic that detectives struggled to assemble into a coherent picture. Rumors spread quickly through the town, adding another layer of complication. Parents whispered warnings to their children. Friends speculated about older teens or strangers. The gossip mill churned non-stop, shaping perceptions of who might be responsible, often before any evidence could confirm it. Detectives had to wade through fear, suspicion, and false accusations while searching for the truth. During this time, small but puzzling clues emerged. Emily's backpack had been moved slightly, as if someone had rifled through it but left her personal writings untouched. The swing scratches suggested more than ordinary use. And fibers found near the scene hinted at clothing or material that didn't belong to Emily, or anyone in her immediate circle. Yet, these pieces didn't add up in 1985. Detective Whitaker kept meticulous notes, documenting every witness statement, every lead, and every odd detail. He sensed early on that this wasn't a random act. Someone had planned the encounter, calculated the timing, and left few traces behind. But who? And why? The community grew restless as the investigation unfolded. School officials increased patrols, parents walked their children to and from events, and the local news broadcast updates that offered little reassurance. Auburn was a town accustomed to small, peaceful summers, but now the shadow of fear hung over every street. Despite the frustrations, the detectives refused to stop. They spent long nights poring over maps, re-interviewing witnesses, and trying to reconcile conflicting accounts. Each contradiction became a potential key, each rumor a clue disguised in fear. They knew that somewhere among these pieces lay the truth of Emily Lawson's final hours. And yet, the first wave of investigation, with all its effort, would eventually hit walls. Leads went cold. Suspects were cleared. And the town's questions remained unanswered. Emily's story had entered a chapter that would stretch into decades of uncertainty, suspicion, and relentless hope. The initial investigation set the stage for everything that followed. It revealed the limitations of the time, the human element of error, and the shadows that can hide in even the most familiar streets. And in the hearts of her family, one question burned brighter than ever: who took Emily Lawson, and would anyone ever find her killer? As weeks turned into months, and months into years, the trail of Emily Lawson's disappearance grew cold. Leads dried up. Suspects were cleared. And Auburn's quiet streets carried a tension that refused to lift. Detective Thomas Whitaker, now feeling the weight of years, often returned to the original scene in his mind. Every witness statement he had collected, every fingerprint, every fiber, was revisited endlessly, but none offered the breakthrough he desperately sought. The frustration was compounded by the limitations of 1980s forensics. DNA testing was primitive, evidence storage was imperfect, and many small towns, Auburn included, lacked resources for ongoing cold case investigations. For the Lawson family, each passing day was a silent torment. Linda Lawson described evenings spent pacing the living room, staring at the empty space where Emily's laughter used to echo. Roger, her father, would walk the streets Emily had loved, retracing her final bike ride, hoping, in some impossible way, that it might reveal a clue. The emotional toll was relentless. Holidays became hollow reminders of her absence. Birthdays went uncelebrated or were marked by quiet candlelight for a girl who should have been there. Friends drifted away, not out of malice, but because the shadow of grief made every visit painful. Even school events, once vibrant gatherings for the Lawson family, were now silent punctuations of what was lost. Neighbors, too, carried the strain. Parents whispered warnings to their children, who once played freely along Magnolia Street. Children dared each other to approach the abandoned playground, but the thrill of summer games had been replaced by a fear ingrained into Auburn's culture. Emily's absence became a shadow that stretched over an entire generation. Meanwhile, investigators revisited leads that had seemed promising but ultimately failed. Bobby Henderson, Timothy Barnes, and other early suspects were exonerated. New tips from anonymous callers often led to dead ends. Every potential breakthrough seemed just out of reach, and the public's hope began to wane. In the midst of this, rumors and whispered theories began to shape Auburn's perception of the case. Stories circulated of strangers seen near the playground, tales of shadowy figures watching from the woods, and claims of suspicious vehicles at odd hours. Some were harmless neighborhood chatter, others became urban legends that would linger for decades. The line between fact and fear blurred, creating a community haunted not just by a crime, but by the unknown. Yet, even as the investigation stalled, small pieces of overlooked evidence remained. The swing scratches, faint fibers, and the tiny pendant found near Emily's body, details dismissed by some at the time, were quietly catalogued in the police files. These fragments, while seemingly minor, would later prove crucial when new technology allowed investigators to re-examine the case. For the Lawson family, the uncertainty was unbearable. Linda described sleepless nights imagining her daughter's last moments, wondering if Emily had been scared, if she had called out, if someone could have stopped what happened. Roger, meanwhile, carried a quiet rage beneath his grief, a desire for justice that refused to fade, no matter how many years passed. The community itself changed under the weight of the unsolved crime. Auburn, once a town where everyone knew their neighbors and children roamed freely, became a place of caution. Porch lights stayed on later, parents drove their kids to school instead of letting them walk, and strangers were watched with suspicion. Fear, mingled with hope, became a defining feature of life here. The passage of time also brought false comfort. Some believed Emily's killer had left town or died. Others whispered that the case would remain a mystery forever. Yet, investigators like Whitaker knew better. Somewhere, in the overlooked files, the misinterpreted clues, and the faded witness notes, the truth waited. As anniversaries passed, the Lawson family marked each year with quiet reflection. Candles were lit on Emily's birthday. Flowers were placed at her grave on the day she vanished. Each ritual reinforced the unshakable presence of loss, while also keeping hope alive, a hope that one day, the community would learn who was responsible. Even school children learned the story. Emily Lawson became a cautionary tale whispered in classrooms and playgrounds, her absence woven into the town's memory. It was a reminder that danger could strike anywhere, and that some questions, though unanswered, demanded justice. By the late 1980s, the case had grown cold. Files were stored in dusty cabinets, leads archived, and active investigations slowed to periodic reviews. For most of Auburn, Emily's story was a tragedy that belonged to the past. For the Lawsons, and for the few detectives who never stopped looking, it was a story that demanded a resolution, no matter how long it took. The years of silence were heavy, filled with grief, frustration, and lingering fear. Yet they also preserved the fragments of a case that refused to be forgotten. And as the world moved on, the seeds of a future breakthrough were quietly taking root, waiting for the day when technology, persistence, and a single clue would finally bring Emily Lawson's killer to justice. As the years passed, Emily Lawson's disappearance became more than a cold case. It became a story whispered in Auburn streets, a tale that blended grief with imagination. Children dared each other to approach the old playground at night, while parents warned them away, repeating the tragic story of the girl who vanished one summer evening. Local legend grew quickly. Some claimed to see a shadowy figure lurking near Magnolia Street, just as Emily had vanished. Others spoke of a strange car, always parked in the same spot, empty and silent, as if it waited for something, or someone. Over time, these stories became part of Auburn's folklore, retold with each generation. High school students whispered about Emily's ghost appearing near the swings, her laughter echoing faintly before vanishing into the night. Teenagers dared one another to leave notes at the site, hoping to provoke a response from the unseen. The thrill of fear mixed with sadness, creating a haunting legend that carried the essence of Emily's story forward, even as details of the crime faded from memory. Adults, meanwhile, struggled with their own versions of the story. Neighbors claimed to have seen strangers in the area at odd hours. Shopkeepers recounted minor incidents, someone looking into windows, fleeting glimpses of a dark coat. Each account fed the rumor mill, keeping the town on edge while reinforcing the mystery of Emily's disappearance. Detectives, aware of these stories, often approached them cautiously. Some elements held kernels of truth, hints of overlooked leads, or forgotten witnesses. Others were fabrications, distorted by grief, fear, or the human tendency to seek patterns where none exist. Yet, even fiction carried weight, sometimes guiding investigators back to real evidence. One popular tale involved a lone figure who walked the streets late at night, carrying a lantern, searching for something lost. Children would peek through windows, whispering that it was Emily's spirit, trying to guide them away from danger. Some parents reported leaving small offerings near the playground, a candle, a flower, as if paying respects to a ghostly presence, a ritual that blended sorrow and superstition. Urban myths also arose from overlooked details at the crime scene. The missing bicycle, the scattered backpack, the tiny pendant, all became symbols and stories that stretched far beyond reality. In some retellings, the pendant was said to hold a secret message. In others, the swing scratches were marks left by an invisible force. While detectives filed these anecdotes carefully, they knew some truths were hiding within the tales, waiting for a chance to resurface. The community legends served a dual purpose. They expressed grief, fear, and frustration, but they also kept Emily's story alive. Each whisper, each dare, each shadow sighting reminded Auburn that her case had never been forgotten, that someone, maybe even the killer, had left a mark that time could not erase. And somewhere, buried beneath folklore, was the path to justice. Even after decades, these myths fueled small discoveries. A retired neighbor might remember a fleeting figure overlooked in youth. A childhood friend recalled a subtle gesture that didn't make sense at the time. These recollections, filtered through time and legend, would one day help piece together what really happened on that summer night in 1985. The legends, however, were bittersweet. They entertained, they thrilled, but they also reminded the town of a truth too heavy to ignore. A young girl had been taken, and her family lived every day with the ache of unanswered questions. Auburn's collective memory, intertwined with myths, became a tapestry of hope, fear, and lingering doubt. As investigators prepared for the eventual breakthrough decades later, these stories were revisited. Every rumor, every ghostly sighting, every whispered tale was re-examined for hidden clues. What had once been dismissed as superstition became a subtle guidepost, pointing toward the overlooked evidence that would finally crack the case wide open. In the end, the myths were more than just stories. They were a record of a community's grief, a warning, and a testament to the enduring memory of Emily Lawson. And in the shadows of those tales lay the threads of truth, waiting patiently for the moment they would be woven into justice. 3 decades had passed since Emily Lawson vanished. Auburn had changed, but the case files remained, tucked away in dusty cabinets at the police station. Then, in the spring of 2015, a small, seemingly insignificant event ignited a chain reaction that would reopen one of Alabama's most haunting cold cases. It started with a routine audit of cold case evidence. Detective Laura Mitchell, recently transferred to Auburn PD and known for her meticulous nature, was reviewing archived files and photographs. When she pulled Emily's file, she noticed a faint, previously overlooked detail in the evidence logs, a strand of fiber collected near the swing scratches. At the time of the original investigation, the fiber had been catalogued but could not be analyzed properly. DNA technology in 1985 was rudimentary. Now, in 2015, advancements allowed forensic labs to examine trace evidence at a level previously unimaginable. Detective Mitchell, sensing the potential, sent the fiber to the state crime lab for analysis. Days later, the lab called with preliminary results. The fiber matched a rare fabric, one used in a specific brand of jacket sold in Alabama in the mid-1980s. It was a small detail, but in the world of cold cases, even the tiniest clue could be a lifeline. Meanwhile, Detective Whitaker, still deeply invested despite his retirement, was contacted by Mitchell. Together, they reviewed every detail, the witness statements, the tire tracks, the missing bicycle, the swing scratches. They realized that several pieces of evidence, once dismissed, were starting to form a pattern. One breakthrough came from a neighbor's recollection. An elderly resident remembered a dark jacket worn by a man walking near the playground the night Emily disappeared. It matched the description of the fiber found decades later. This small coincidence began to narrow the field of suspects. Simultaneously, Mitchell uncovered a set of old travel receipts linked to a local man who had never been fully questioned, someone previously overlooked due to a seemingly airtight alibi. The receipts placed him near Auburn during the summer of 1985, contradicting earlier statements. Then came the final, shocking catalyst, a deathbed confession. A man in a neighboring county, long rumored to have information about Emily's disappearance, had been hospitalized. In his final hours, he told a nurse he knew the truth and that the law needed to see the papers in the old Lawson file. The nurse immediately contacted authorities, setting the investigation into motion again. Detectives retrieved the files the man referenced. Inside were photographs, handwritten notes, and correspondence that had been overlooked or misfiled in 1985. The new analysis of the fiber, combined with the handwritten timeline and the travel receipts, began to paint a clear picture of Emily's final hours. For the first time in 30 years, investigators could see the outlines of a plan, a sequence of events that had gone unnoticed. The missing bicycle had been taken to lure Emily to a specific location. The swing scratches indicated a struggle that had been misinterpreted as innocent. The rare fabric fiber tied directly to a suspect previously dismissed as unrelated. This catalyst event reignited the case, bringing new energy to a town long resigned to sorrow. Detectives Mitchell and Whitaker knew that they were on the verge of unraveling a decades-old mystery. Every overlooked note, every minor inconsistency, and every piece of old evidence was now seen in a new light, connecting dots that had been invisible for years. The community, too, felt the shift. Media outlets reported that Auburn's most infamous cold case was being revisited. Families who had lived with unanswered questions for decades began to hope again. And in quiet moments, the Lawsons allowed themselves to imagine what they had long feared impossible: justice might finally come. This moment, an overlooked fiber, a deathbed confession, and new technology, was the spark. It reminded investigators that no case is ever truly dead. That even decades later, persistence, attention to detail, and a touch of luck could breathe life into cold files and bring truth to light. And as the detectives prepared to close in on the suspect, the pieces of Emily Lawson's story were finally starting to fit together. A web of lies, fear, and decades of silence was beginning to unravel. Auburn, long haunted by memory and rumor, braced for a revelation that would shake the town to its core. The catalyst event had done its work. The case was no longer cold. The investigation was alive, moving forward with a clarity that had eluded Auburn's police for 30 years. And at the heart of it all was the question everyone had been waiting to answer: who had taken Emily Lawson, and would justice finally be served? With the new evidence in hand, Auburn Police Department reopened the investigation in full force. Detective Laura Mitchell took the lead, collaborating closely with retired Sergeant Thomas Whitaker, whose decades of experience with Emily Lawson's case proved invaluable. For the first time in 30 years, the pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. Detectives began retracing old leads, re-interviewing witnesses whose statements had once seemed contradictory or irrelevant. Many remembered details they had forgotten: a dark jacket, a strange car, a man lingering near the playground. Taken together with the fiber evidence, these recollections formed a coherent pattern pointing toward a single suspect: Alan Prescott, a local man who had lived on the edge of town in 1985 and remained in Auburn for decades. Prescott, then in his mid-30s, had been known for his quiet demeanor and meticulous habits. He had a history of minor offenses, mostly trespassing and petty theft, but nothing violent, which is why investigators had overlooked him in the original inquiry. Now, however, his alibi began to unravel under scrutiny. Travel records, previously dismissed as routine, revealed Prescott had been near Magnolia Street the evening Emily disappeared. Receipts from a local store contradicted his original statement, and witnesses recalled seeing him in the vicinity when he claimed to be elsewhere. The web of lies, once hidden beneath decades of small-town familiarity, began to tighten. Detective Mitchell reviewed handwritten notes found in the re-examined files, cross-referencing them with old photographs and witness statements. Patterns emerged: the missing bicycle, the swing scratches, even subtle changes to Emily's school schedule. All fit within a timeline Prescott could not explain. For the first time, investigators could visualize the calculated nature of the crime. Meanwhile, Prescott's daily habits were quietly observed. Surveillance footage from local stores, when cross-referenced with old photos, suggested he had opportunities to act without drawing suspicion. Detectives noticed subtle inconsistencies in how he recounted events from 30 years ago, gaps, hesitations, and contradictions that only became apparent under intense questioning. Tension rises slightly. New witness interviews added fuel to the fire. A former co-worker recalled seeing Prescott with a jacket matching the fiber sample described by the lab. Another neighbor remembered him carrying a bag near the playground the day Emily vanished, something he had never mentioned. These small details, combined with modern forensic analysis, were finally closing in on the truth. Detectives also revisited the crime scene, applying modern investigative techniques. They photographed, measured, and reconstructed the playground and surrounding streets, uncovering subtle evidence missed in 1985. The swing scratches were analyzed under magnification, revealing the likely struggle points. Tire tracks were matched with Prescott's long-defunct vehicle. Each piece of evidence reinforced the growing case against him. The detectives now had both a physical and behavioral profile. Prescott had planned his movements carefully, exploiting the town's trust and the limitations of law enforcement at the time. Yet his meticulousness had left trace evidence, a rare fiber, faint fibers on clothing, subtle contradictions in his story, that modern investigators could finally detect. Detective Whitaker, reviewing the reconstructed timeline, realized the emotional weight of the moment. For 30 years, Emily's family had lived with uncertainty. Now, the pieces of the case were aligned in a way that felt undeniable. For the first time, justice felt within reach. Soft. The detectives moved carefully, knowing the importance of building an airtight case. Every statement was documented, every piece of physical evidence catalogued, and every potential loophole considered. Prescott had lived decades under the shadow of suspicion, but now the net was closing, and the law would not allow it to slip through again. By piecing together the forgotten details, overlooked evidence, and decades-old inconsistencies, the investigators had created a mosaic of the crime. It was clear who had taken Emily Lawson, how he had acted, and why the original investigation had failed to connect the dots. The cold case, once dormant, was alive with clarity and direction. And so, as Auburn braced for the next step, the detectives prepared to confront Prescott. Every interview, every observation, every scrap of evidence had led to this moment. The past and present converged, bringing the town to the edge of long-awaited resolution. The stage was set for confrontation. 30 years of unanswered questions, decades of grief and rumor, and years of relentless detective work were about to collide. Auburn's darkest summer was nearing its reckoning, and the truth about Emily Lawson's fate would finally emerge. The day had finally come. After decades of silence, re-examined evidence, and painstaking detective work, Auburn police were ready to confront Alan Prescott. Every detail had been double-checked: witness statements, fiber analysis, travel records. There was no room for error. Detective Laura Mitchell, flanked by Sergeant Whitaker and uniformed officers, approached Prescott's modest home on the outskirts of town. The house, unchanged for decades, seemed almost frozen in time, mirroring the long-forgotten case that had haunted Auburn since 1985. Neighbors watched from behind curtains, sensing that a reckoning was imminent. Inside, Prescott was unaware that investigators were closing in. His routine, carefully maintained over 30 years, had lulled him into a false sense of security. The detectives knocked firmly, and after a tense moment, he opened the door. Mitchell identified herself, explaining they needed to speak regarding the Lawson case. Prescott's reaction was subtle at first, a flicker of recognition, a slight tension in his posture. But as Mitchell presented the fiber evidence, the travel receipts, and the witness recollections, his defenses began to crumble. His carefully constructed alibi, which had held for 3 decades, could no longer withstand scrutiny. "Mr. Prescott," Mitchell said, her voice calm but firm, "we know you were near Magnolia Street the night Emily Lawson disappeared. We have the evidence to prove it." Prescott's eyes darted briefly to the floor. He swallowed hard, his breathing shallow. The arrest was swift but deliberate. Officers gently but firmly placed handcuffs on Prescott, reading him his rights. For the first time, a suspect was being held accountable for the crime that had left Auburn haunted for 30 years. The weight of the moment was not lost on the detectives. Decades of frustration, grief, and unanswered questions were finally converging. Prescott was escorted to the police car. Neighbors peered from windows, whispers spreading quickly, they got him, after all these years. In that moment, the town collectively exhaled, a mixture of relief, anticipation, and lingering sorrow filling the air. At the station, Mitchell and Whitaker began the interrogation. Prescott initially denied wrongdoing, his tone measured, his expressions controlled. But as the detectives methodically presented the timeline, the fiber match, and eyewitness accounts, cracks appeared in his demeanor. Small hesitations, nervous twitches, and averted eyes betrayed the truth he had hidden for decades. "We know what happened, Alan," Whitaker said, leaning forward. "We have the proof. It's time to tell us the truth." Prescott's voice wavered, a mixture of defiance and fear. After a tense silence, he began to speak, his confession slow, fragmented, yet undeniably revealing the events of that summer night. The confession confirmed the details detectives had painstakingly pieced together: how Prescott had lured Emily to the playground, the struggle near the swings, and the steps he took to cover his actions. Each detail, long hidden beneath layers of fear and time, was now exposed, validating decades of investigation and painstaking forensic work. For the Lawson family, the news was overwhelming. Linda and Roger Lawson, who had endured 30 years of grief and unanswered questions, were notified immediately. Their reaction, a mix of relief, sorrow, and cautious hope, mirrored the emotions of an entire community finally facing the truth. The arrest sent ripples through Auburn. Longtime residents who had whispered theories for decades now had confirmation. The town, once shadowed by fear and rumor, began to experience a fragile sense of closure. Yet beneath the relief was the stark reality of the crime and the loss that could never be replaced. Detectives Mitchell and Whitaker understood the significance. This was not just an arrest, it was the vindication of persistent investigative work, the proof that cold cases can be solved, and the affirmation that the truth, no matter how long delayed, will eventually surface. And for Auburn, justice, long deferred, was finally within reach. As Prescott was booked and processed, the community braced for the next phase, trial and sentencing. Every family member, neighbor, and former classmate prepared to confront the reality of the man who had lived among them, hiding a decades-old secret. The arrest had answered the question that had haunted the town for 30 years, but it also raised another: how would justice be served after all this time? The trial of Alan Prescott began in the summer of 2016, over 3 decades after Emily Lawson vanished. Auburn's courthouse was packed with family, friends, journalists, and residents who had followed the case for years. Emotions ran high: anticipation, grief, and a sense that justice, long delayed, was finally at hand. Prosecutors presented a meticulous timeline, drawing from the breakthrough evidence uncovered in the reopened investigation. Fiber analysis, travel receipts, witness statements, and Prescott's own confession were laid out methodically. Each piece of evidence, long dormant in dusty files, now formed an undeniable narrative of guilt. Eyewitnesses took the stand. Neighbors described fleeting observations of Prescott near Magnolia Street that night. Former co-workers recounted odd behaviors, previously dismissed as harmless eccentricity. Each testimony, corroborating the physical evidence, painted a picture of someone long hidden in plain sight. The prosecution also called Detective Laura Mitchell, who explained the significance of the modern forensic analysis. She detailed how the rare fiber found at the scene had matched Prescott's jacket, and how new technology had allowed them to reconstruct events with a clarity that was impossible in 1985. The courtroom fell silent, absorbing the decades-long investigative journey condensed into testimony. Prescott's defense attempted to challenge the evidence, questioning memory reliability after so many years and suggesting the fiber evidence could be coincidental. But the jury, guided by a clear narrative and unbroken chain of proof, found these arguments unconvincing. The weight of decades of investigation, combined with Prescott's own admissions, left little room for doubt. Family members provided the most emotional moments. Linda Lawson, Emily's mother, described her daughter's laughter, her bright smile, and the small joys that were stolen the night of the crime. Her voice trembled as she recounted decades of unanswered questions, the pain of birthdays and graduations missed, and the long shadow cast over their family. Her words were a reminder that justice, even after decades, was about more than punishment, it was about acknowledgement and closure. Emily's younger brother, Michael Lawson, spoke of the community's struggle. How neighbors had feared walking alone at night, how children had grown up hearing whispered tales of her disappearance, and how the town's collective memory had been shaped by sorrow and speculation. His testimony humanized the case, transforming abstract facts into lived experience. As the trial progressed, Prescott grew visibly strained. The courtroom captured fleeting glimpses of frustration, anxiety, and the inevitable weight of truth pressing down. Even his carefully constructed persona of composure began to fracture under the scrutiny of modern forensic science, witness accounts, and decades of unresolved grief. The closing arguments were deliberate and precise. The prosecution emphasized the meticulous nature of Prescott's deception, the courage of investigators who refused to let the case die, and the enduring impact on the Lawson family and the Auburn community. The defense urged caution, but the evidence spoke for itself. Finally, after hours of deliberation, the jury returned. The courtroom was tense, every eye fixed on the judge as the verdict was read aloud, guilty on all counts. A collective sigh passed through the room, relief, grief, and a measure of justice mingled in the air. Prescott was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the first time in over 30 years, the Lawson family felt a sense of closure. Not a restoration of what was lost, but a formal acknowledgement of the truth and the accountability finally exacted. The trial served as a testament to perseverance. Detectives, forensic scientists, and ordinary citizens who refused to forget had brought justice to a case long considered cold. Auburn, scarred but resilient, had faced the dark chapters of its past and emerged with the knowledge that truth, no matter how delayed, will prevail. For the community, the trial was more than legal proceedings. It was a reckoning, a public affirmation that Emily Lawson's life mattered, and that her absence had not been in vain. The echoes of grief remained, but alongside them was a fragile hope, that justice, persistence, and memory could coexist, healing some of the wounds left behind. As Auburn absorbed the verdict, thoughts began to shift to the future. Questions lingered. How do you rebuild a community shaken by decades of fear? How do you honor a life stolen too soon? These were questions the town would continue to wrestle with, but for now, the scales of justice had been balanced, and the long shadow of Emily Lawson's disappearance was finally illuminated. With Alan Prescott sentenced and the trial concluded, Auburn began the slow process of healing. 30 years of unanswered questions, whispered rumors, and quiet grief had finally reached a resolution. Yet the impact of Emily Lawson's disappearance lingered, shaping the town and her family in ways that could never fully be undone. For the Lawson family, justice brought a mixture of relief and sorrow. Linda Lawson, who had spent decades advocating for answers, described the feeling as bittersweet. She had her daughter's name formally acknowledged in the courtroom, a symbolic closure for a life so tragically cut short, but the void remained. Birthdays, graduations, and ordinary moments were lost forever, reminders of what could never be reclaimed. Michael Lawson, Emily's brother, spoke about the community's resilience. "We've learned that grief doesn't disappear," he said, "but it evolves. And so does our understanding of what it means to keep her memory alive." Local schools held memorial events, and the playground where Emily was last seen was refurbished and dedicated in her honor, a tangible reminder of both loss and hope. Detectives Mitchell and Whitaker reflected on the broader meaning of their work. The case highlighted the importance of persistence, attention to detail, and the evolving power of forensic science. It also reminded them, and the nation, that cold cases are never truly gone. They exist in waiting, holding the potential for justice, even decades later. The town of Auburn, once defined by fear and uncertainty, began to reclaim its sense of safety. Community events, long avoided near the playground, resumed with cautious optimism. Residents who had whispered theories now shared stories openly, honoring Emily's memory while acknowledging the resilience of their community. The darkness of the past remained, but it no longer dominated the town's present. Emily's story became a symbol of persistence and truth. Local law enforcement implemented new protocols for cold cases, ensuring that evidence was preserved and reviewed with modern techniques. Advocates for families of missing persons cited the Lawson case as a turning point, demonstrating that even long-forgotten cases could be solved with determination and collaboration. Yet reflection also carried a sobering lesson: the importance of vigilance. Prescott had lived among the community for decades without accountability, a reminder of the hidden dangers that can exist in small towns. Auburn, while celebrating closure, remained vigilant, recognizing that the scars of the past informed the vigilance of the present. For the Lawsons, the resolution allowed them to begin living beyond the shadow of Emily's disappearance. They organized memorial scholarships, supported local missing persons initiatives, and worked to ensure that no other family would endure such prolonged uncertainty. In honoring Emily's life, they transformed grief into purpose. Detectives Mitchell and Whitaker, now hailed as heroes in Auburn, reminded the public that justice is often a marathon, not a sprint. Persistence, even in the face of decades of silence, can uncover the truth. Their collaboration bridged generations of law enforcement, proving that experience, combined with modern innovation, can bring closure to even the coldest of cases. As Auburn streets settled into quiet nights once more, the story of Emily Lawson became a part of the town's history, a reminder of both human fragility and resilience. Her memory, preserved through community efforts, legal justice, and enduring love, served as a beacon for families still waiting for answers, a testament to the fact that no disappearance is ever truly forgotten. The Lawson family, the investigators, and the town had achieved a measure of justice. While the pain of loss would always linger, the weight of uncertainty had been lifted. Auburn had confronted its past, acknowledged the truth, and begun the journey toward healing, a journey marked by resilience, remembrance, and the enduring hope that the truth will always find its way to light. And yet, even as the community breathed a sigh of relief, a quiet question lingered in the minds of the detectives. Could another long-forgotten secret, another unanswered case, be waiting just around the corner? Auburn had found closure, for now, but the work of justice never truly ends. Just as Auburn began to settle, Detective Laura Mitchell's phone rang late one evening. A new tip had arrived, an anonymous caller claiming to have information about a case eerily similar to Emily Lawson's disappearance. The details were vague, but the timing and location were enough to pique the detective's attention. "We've received reports of another cold case, one that happened nearly 10 years later," the caller said, voice distorted. "There are connections to the Lawson case you might not see at first." Mitchell scribbled notes furiously, the weight of 30 years of investigation suddenly converging with the unknown of a new mystery. The description was unsettling. A young girl, similar age to Emily, disappeared near the outskirts of town under circumstances that mirrored Prescott's known movements. Witnesses claimed to have seen a man matching Prescott's description decades earlier, now untraceable. Fibers and footprints at the new scene hinted at the possibility of an older pattern, suggesting the town's hidden darkness might stretch farther than anyone had realized. Mitchell's mind raced. Could Prescott have had an accomplice, someone who remained undetected? Or was this a copycat, inspired by the decades-old crime that had haunted Auburn? The uncertainty gnawed at her, a reminder that even solved cases can echo in unexpected ways. Detectives Whitaker and Mitchell agreed on one thing: this new case needed immediate attention. Evidence from the original investigation, files, photos, witness statements, would have to be re-examined, connections scrutinized, and patterns analyzed for the first time in decades. Every small detail could be the key to preventing another tragedy. As the team prepared to reopen the new investigation, Auburn held its collective breath. The town, still healing from the emotional scars of Emily Lawson's disappearance, faced the unsettling possibility that history could repeat itself. Streets once quiet with relief now felt charged with tension, and the memory of what had been lost lingered in every shadow. Mitchell stared at the anonymous tip, the implications settling heavily on her shoulders. The phone call was brief, yet its resonance would shape the next chapter of her career and Auburn's history. One thing was clear: even when justice is served, the past has a way of reaching forward, demanding attention, and refusing to stay buried. The files were pulled, the crime scenes revisited, and a renewed investigation began, this time into a case that seemed almost impossible, yet inescapably connected to Emily Lawson. And as the night fell over Auburn, a chilling realization settled over the detectives: the town's darkest secrets might be far from fully revealed. The question now loomed large: had Emily Lawson's case truly closed, or was it merely the opening act for a deeper, more disturbing pattern? Auburn's streets, its families, and its detectives were about to find out, and the answers would test the limits of patience, persistence, and the very definition of justice.